She read it standing by the window of the rented room she could no longer afford, the paper thin and official-looking in a way that meant someone with power had signed it. The Voss estate, what remained of it after her father's debts had been catalogued, reviewed, and formally condemned, would pass to creditors by the 1st of November, unless a sum she could not name aloud without her hands shaking was delivered in full. She had 3 weeks. She folded the letter and placed it beneath the loose floorboard where she kept her father's journals, the ledgers she'd been slowly translating from his impossible handwriting, and the one piece of evidence she'd found buried in the last of them, a transaction, dated 11 years ago, that bore a name she recognized, Lord Aldrich Penfield, the same Lord Penfield who sat on the Royal Land Council, the same Lord Penfield whose signature appeared on the seizure order for the Voss estate, the same Lord Penfield who had, according to her father's ledger, received a significant and undocumented payment from a third party in the same year he had first filed a complaint against the Voss family with the Crown. Cecilia was not a woman who frightened easily. She had grown up watching her father navigate a world that wanted him smaller than he was, and she had learned from him the particular art of being inconvenient to powerful people while appearing entirely harmless. She had taught herself French, Italian, and enough legal Latin to understand the documents that had been used to dismantle her family's name. She had spent the last 14 months living carefully, eating less than she should, and building a case she had no legal standing to present. What she needed was a room, specifically the kind of room where Lord Aldrich Penfield would be present, where the right words spoken to the right person could plant a seed of doubt about a man who had for 11 years considered himself entirely safe. The Duke of Renmore's autumn ball was that room. She obtained the invitation through a chain of small deceits she refused to feel guilty about. A connection to a dressmaker, a favor owed, a name borrowed from a distant cousin who had no intention of attending, and even less interest in the proceedings of the English aristocracy. The name was Harrow. Miss Clara Harrow of the Somerset Harrows, a family respectable enough to be unremarkable and obscure enough to generate no scrutiny. She stood now before the cracked mirror in her rented room, pinning the last of the alterations into the blue silk dress she had spent 2 weeks reconstructing from something her mother had worn in better years. The fabric was good. The cut was hers. She had done it herself in the evenings, dath the poor candlelight, with the kind of patience that comes from having no other options. She looked, she thought, like someone who belonged in that room. She had to, because if she didn't, she would never get close enough to Penfield to say what needed to be said. And if she never said it, the 1st of November would arrive, and with it the end of the last thing her father had left her. She picked up her gloves. She did not let herself hesitate. She had already decided. Renmore House stood at the end of a long gravel drive that had been raked into perfect lines, and the candlelight from its upper windows spilled gold across the frost-touched grass in a way that was either beautiful or intimidating, depending entirely on how much money you had. Cecilia stepped down from the hired carriage and adjusted her gloves. She had arrived early enough to avoid the worst of the crush at the entrance, and late enough that her arrival would not be notable. She had calculated this deliberately. She had also spent the better part of the afternoon memorizing the names of the Somerset Harrows' nearest neighbours, their preferred social causes, and the approximate location of their estate relative to the nearest market town. Enough to sustain a 5-minute conversation without contradiction. The entrance hall was exactly what she had expected. Marble floors, a double staircase ascending in 2 broad arcs toward a gallery, where musicians were already producing the kind of refined, decorative sound that indicated the evening had not yet properly begun. Footmen positioned at intervals, guests moving in that particular slow drift that meant no one had found anything interesting to do yet. She gave her borrowed name to the man at the door and moved inside. The ballroom was enormous and deliberately so, the kind of room designed to remind its occupants of their own smallness while simultaneously making them feel chosen. Crystal hung from the ceiling in arrangements that caught the light and scattered it. The floor had been polished to a shine that reflected the hem of every dress, so that the women present appeared to float above their own shadows. Along the far wall, a row of tall windows looked out onto gardens that had been strategically illuminated with torches, and the effect was theatrical in a way that suggested the Duke of Renmore understood exactly what he was doing when he arranged a room. She had not yet seen the Duke of Renmore. She had asked quietly and carefully about him. He was spoken of in two distinct registers, depending on who was speaking. Among men of business he was considered precise, and the word carried respect. He was a man who read contracts before signing them, who did not make promises he did not intend to keep, who had a memory for detail that made careless people nervous in his presence. Among women of the court, he was described as handsome and unavailable, which were offered as two separate facts, but were generally understood to be connected. She was not thinking about any of that. She was thinking about Penfield, who she had identified from across the room before she had finished crossing the threshold. A broad man with silver at his temples, and the particular ease of someone who had never had a reason to be cautious. He was speaking with two other men near the eastern wall, laughing at something, his glass raised in a gesture of comfortable self-congratulation that made something cold settle in Cecilia's chest. She looked away before anyone could notice her looking. She accepted a glass from a passing footman and positioned herself at the edge of the nearest conversation, a small cluster of women discussing the merits of the Duke's new conservatory, and listened with the expression of someone mildly interested, which was a useful expression to wear in rooms where you were gathering information. It was in this position, listening without contributing, that she first became aware of a change in the room. It was not dramatic. There was no announcement. The musicians did not pause, and yet something shifted, the way temperature shifts before a storm, in that moment before the first drop falls. The conversations around her didn't stop so much as they reorganized themselves, orienting in a direction she hadn't yet identified. She turned, following the invisible current. At the top of the staircase a man had appeared. He wasn't tall in a showy way, not a man who used his height to fill a room. What he used instead was stillness. He stood at the top of the stairs and simply looked at the room below him with the patience of someone who had decided exactly how much of his attention it had earned. His hair was dark, his jaw clean, his evening coat the kind of dark blue that absorbed the light rather than catching it. He wore no unnecessary ornamentation. What he did wear, he wore as though it belonged to him. He descended the stairs slowly, and the room rearranged itself around his path, without seeming to realize it was doing so. He passed within 20 feet of Cecilia, without looking at her. She told herself she was relieved. Then Lord Penfield caught her eye from across the room and smiled, and she straightened her spine and reminded herself what she had come here to do. She positioned herself near the supper room at 9:30, which was when Lord Penfield separated from his companions to refill his glass. She had timed this. She had not survived the past 14 months on instinct alone. "Lord Penfield," she said as he turned from the sideboard. Her voice was exactly as composed as she needed it to be. "I believe we share a mutual acquaintance, Sir James Harrow of Somerset?" It was a small lie, deployed with precision. Penfield accepted it without scrutiny. She had counted on the fact that men in his position rarely checked the genealogy of young women who approached them pleasantly at parties. "Indeed," he said, with the mild interest of a man being politely courteous. "And how does Sir James fare?" "Very well, I'm told." She let the conversation settle before she continued. "I've recently had occasion to review some older land records, a family matter quite dull, and I came across a notation I found rather puzzling. A transaction recorded in 1812 involving several Somerset estates and a council review that was, it seemed, rather hastily resolved." She kept her expression curious, not accusatory. "I don't suppose you would remember it. Given your position on the Land Council, I imagine such things passed through your office." Something changed in Penfield's face. It was subtle, a slight flattening of the expression, a recalibration behind the eyes. He was experienced enough not to show alarm outright, but she had been watching his face too carefully to miss it. "That was some time ago," he said. "I couldn't speak to individual transactions." "Of course not," she agreed pleasantly. "It's simply that the name attached to the notation was rather specific, and I'm told the family in question has recently faced some difficulties that seem, on reflection, connected to that same period." She tilted her head. "I do find these coincidences interesting, don't you?" She watched him decide. in real time what she was. The problem was that she had miscalculated the audience. She had chosen her position carefully with respect to Penfield, too carefully. She had not accounted for the fact that in moving to intercept him, she had placed herself in the path of the Duke of Renmore, who had apparently been crossing the same corridor at the same moment and had stopped within earshot at the precise moment she'd begun speaking. She did not know this until Penfield's eyes moved, just briefly, over her left shoulder. She did not turn. She continued as though she hadn't noticed, but something cold and specific ran through her. The recognition that she had been heard, by whom she didn't yet know, by someone who mattered, she was almost certain. Penfield excused himself with a courtesy that was one layer thinner than it had been 60 seconds earlier, and moved away into the crowd with a purpose he tried to disguise as casualness and failed. She let out a breath. "That," said a voice behind her, quiet and without expression, "was either very brave or very unwise. I'm not yet certain which." She turned. The Duke of Renmore was standing 3 feet away, his glass held loosely at his side, watching her with the focused stillness of a man who had learned to observe before he spoke. Up close, the quality that had reorganized the room around him was easier to understand. It was not charm. It was the absence of performance, the unsettling impression that he was not managing himself for her benefit, or for anyone else's, and that this was unusual enough to be striking. "Perhaps both," and she said, because there was no point in pretending he hadn't heard her. He studied her for a moment that lasted slightly longer than was comfortable. "Miss—" He waited. "Harrow?" she said. "Clara Harrow." He said nothing to this. He simply looked at her, not in the way that men at parties usually looked at women, appraisingly or dismissively or with the particular focus of calculated interest. He looked at her the way someone looks at a sentence they need to read twice before they understand what it is actually saying. "Lord Penfield," he said, "is a man who collects debts and calls them favors." She kept her expression neutral. "You know him well." "Well enough." He looked past her briefly, toward where Penfield had disappeared into the crowd, then back to her. "He will not forget that conversation." "I'm counting on it," she said. Something shifted in his expression, very slightly, the kind of shift that registered more as a change in the quality of his attention than in anything visible on his face. He looked at her as though she had said something that required him to revise an earlier conclusion. He did not ask her to explain. He inclined his head with the exact minimum of deference required by courtesy and walked away. Cecilia watched him go and understood, with the particular clarity of a person who has just made an unexpected miscalculation, that she had attracted precisely the wrong kind of notice. The card arrived between the second and third dances. A footman placed it on the small silver tray beside her with the blank efficiency of someone delivering messages he had no interest in understanding, and she turned it over and read the handwriting on the inside. "Miss Harrow, or whoever you actually are, I would advise you to leave before the supper announcement. You will not enjoy what follows if you remain. A friend." There was no signature. She sat with this for 30 seconds, which was, she had found, the correct amount of time to spend on panic before converting it into a decision. Then she folded the card and placed it in her evening bag, and understood that she had, at some point in the past 2 hours, been identified. By whom was the more pressing question. Whether it was someone intending to help her or intending to destroy her was, at this moment, secondary. She rose and moved toward the edge of the room, looking for exits that weren't the main staircase. She found, instead, Lady Thornwick. Lady Thornwick was 63 years old, had survived 4 kings, 2 regencies, and enough social catastrophes to have developed a manner of speaking that implied she had seen everything and was mildly disappointed by most of it. She was also, Cecilia recalled with a precision that suddenly felt very important, the woman who had been closest friends with Cecilia's mother for 31 years, before that friendship had been quietly severed at the height of the Voss scandal. Lady Thornwick was looking directly at her, not at Clara Harrow, at her. "You have your mother's bearing," Lady Thornwick said without preamble as Cecilia reached her. "I recognized you from across the room. I imagine others will. 2 if they think to look. Her tone was not warm and not cold. It was the tone of someone making an accurate assessment. Your father's daughter at Lord Penfield's host's ball. That is either an extraordinary coincidence or an extraordinary plan. The latter, Cecilia said. Lady Thornwick's gaze moved briefly over the room. Then you should know that Penfield has been speaking to the Countess of Ralston for the past 10 minutes, which usually means he is preparing to announce something unpleasant about someone. He does it at parties. He finds it effective. She looked back at Cecilia. He appears to have identified you. How? Because you spoke to him as someone who knew what they were looking for, Lady Thornwick said, as though this were obvious. He knew your father well enough to recognize the approach, if not yet the face. She paused. What exactly do you have? A ledger entry, a transaction, his name, a date, and a payment I can connect to the complaint filed against my father's estate. Is it enough? Cecilia didn't hesitate. Enough to create doubt, not enough to compel action. Not yet. Lady Thornwick was quiet for a moment. Your father was a good man who trusted people he should not have trusted, she said. That is not a character flaw. It is simply a fact. She set down her glass. There is a member of the Land Council present tonight, Lord Ashby. He is not Penfield's ally. They have been in dispute over a water rights matter for 2 years, and he would find the suggestion of Penfield's misconduct very interesting indeed. She looked at Cecilia. His wife is in the yellow drawing room. She collects grievances about the Land Council the way other women collect china. You have perhaps 20 minutes before Penfield addresses the room. Cecilia absorbed this. Why are you helping me? Lady Thornwick's expression did not change, but something behind it did. A softening so brief it was more like a thought than a feeling. Because I didn't help your mother when I should have, she said, and I have a long memory. She walked away before Cecilia could respond. 20 minutes. Cecilia turned toward the yellow drawing room and walked quickly, and she had almost reached the corridor when the sound of Lord Penfield's voice rose above the music from the direction of the ballroom, clear and carrying and deliberate. I wonder, he said, in the carrying tone of a man who had made a public announcement before and knew exactly how much volume was required, whether our host is aware that one of his guests this evening has given a false name. The music stopped. Cecilia stood in the doorway to the corridor and did not move. I refer, Penfield continued, into the crystalline silence of 200 people holding their breath, to Miss Clara Harrow of Somerset, a young woman who is in fact Miss Cecilia Voss, daughter of the late Arthur Voss, whose estate was formally seized for default and whose family has been, I believe, excluded from polite society for some time. She heard her own name in that room. She heard it land. She turned around and walked back into the ballroom. She walked to the center of the room. This was not what anyone expected her to do. She could see it in the faces nearest to her, the recalibration, the uncertainty, the specific discomfort of people who had prepared themselves to witness a humiliation and were now watching the intended subject of that humiliation walk directly toward the source of it with her chin level and her hands still. She stopped approximately 10 feet from Lord Penfield, who had the presence of mind to maintain his expression, but not quite the presence of mind to conceal that he had not planned for this. You are correct, she said, in a voice pitched to carry. My name is Cecilia Voss. She paused to let the room absorb this. I entered this evening under a borrowed name because I was aware that my own name, in certain circles, would have ensured I never reached the door. She looked at Penfield steadily. I came because I have spent 14 months reviewing my father's records, and I have found, in those records, something I believe warrants examination. Miss Voss, Penfield began with the tone of a man intending to dismiss her. A transaction, she said over him, recorded in your name, dated April 1812, received 4 weeks before you filed the initial complaint against my father's estate with the Land Council. She watched something move across Penfield's face. A payment from a third party, documented in my father's ledger alongside a note in his handwriting. Penfield expects repayment in influence, not coin. The silence in the room changed quality. That ledger, Penfield said, and his voice had taken on the particular edge of a man who has decided to be aggressive because he has no better option, would be the uncorroborated record of a man whose estate was seized for documented financial irregularity. The court of public opinion is not, I think, obliged to accept it. "No," said a voice from the far left of the room. "But I am." Lord Ashby stepped forward from the group he had been standing with, a compact man in his 50s, with the expression of someone who had been waiting for a particular word to be spoken before he permitted himself to speak. "I have been reviewing irregularities in the 1812 land reviews for the better part of a year, Lord Penfield. I was not aware of the Voss ledger. I am now." He looked at Cecilia with brief, precise attention, then back at Penfield. "I would like to see it." The room did not break into noise immediately. It was the kind of silence that precedes noise, the moment before everyone realizes they have permission to react. Penfield said nothing. His jaw was set in the expression of a man calculating his remaining options, which were, Cecilia judged, fewer than he had possessed 20 minutes ago. It was in this moment, while the room was still balanced on the silence before it collapsed into conversation, while Penfield stood across from her with his options narrowing visibly, that she became aware of the Duke of Renmore. He had not moved toward the center of the room. He had not spoken. He was standing near the far window, and had been, she realized for the duration of the preceding minutes, positioned at a slight remove from the crowd, with the clear sightline of someone who had chosen his place deliberately. He was watching Lord Ashby, not watching Penfield, not watching her, watching Ashby. And there was something in the quality of that attention, something too focused for simple observation, that made her understand. She thought of Lord Ashby's sudden appearance, his particular readiness, the precision of his timing. She looked at Renmore, and he had not looked at her. He was still watching the room with the calm attention of a spectator. But something in his posture, in the set of his shoulders, in the way he held his glass without drinking from it, told her something she had not known 20 minutes ago. She looked away before he could catch her looking. The room broke into noise then, the kind of noise that meant the evening had changed, that what came next would not be what anyone had planned, that Lord Penfield would be receiving requests for documentation before the week was out. Lady Thornwick appeared at Cecilia's elbow and pressed her hand once without ceremony. "Lord Ashby," Cecilia said quietly as he approached her, "how long have you been looking into Penfield's records?" "Long enough," Ashby said. "I simply needed someone with access to his earlier transactions." He paused. "I was told to attend tonight, that the occasion might be instructive." He did not say who had told him. He did not need to. Cecilia held her glass and did not look toward the window. The investigation was opened formally 12 days later. Lord Ashby's petition to the Land Council was submitted with 3 supporting documents, 2 of which Cecilia had provided in a meeting at his office the morning after the ball, and 1 of which had apparently come from a source she was not shown and was not asked about. The petition requested a formal review of the 1812 land assessments and specifically named the Voss estate as one of several that warranted re-examination under the new council guidelines. It was not, as Cecilia knew, a resolution. It was a beginning. These things moved slowly. Men with positions and reputations did not surrender either without significant delay, and Lord Penfield had the advantage of a decade of carefully maintained alliances that would require time to erode. But the 1st of November came and went without the creditors acting on the seizure order, a development that her solicitor explained was connected to a procedural stay filed by a third party he was not at liberty to name, pending the outcome of the Land Council review. She did not ask who had filed it. She found herself thinking about this restraint more than was perhaps useful. She had returned to her rented rooms with the same borrowed dress, the same floorboard, with the same collection of documents beneath it, and the same insufficient light for the work she still had to do. The estate was not restored. Her name was not cleared. She was not, in any material sense, in a better position than she had been 3 weeks earlier, except that she was, except that she had walked into the room of the most watched social event of the season under a false name, been publicly identified, and had chosen to stand in the center of that exposure and speak anyway, except that something had been set in motion. In the 2nd week of November, a note arrived. no signature. The handwriting she recognized, though she had seen it only once, in the terse, unhurried script of a man who wrote as he spoke, without excess. The ledger will be useful. Ashby is thorough and patient, the best combination for this work. The review will take time, most things that matter do. She read it twice. She turned it over. On the back, in the same hand, was a single additional line. The name you arrived under was Clara Harrow. The name you left under was your own. That distinction is noted. She set the note on the table. She sat with it for a long time. She had spent 14 months in the company of her father's records. His handwriting, the evidence of a man who had tried to do things correctly in a world that had rewarded him for it poorly. She had carried the weight of his name the way one carries something that is both burden and inheritance, because it belonged to her, because it was the only true thing in a season of performed ones. She thought about a man who had positioned himself at the edge of a room during the most important moment of her argument, watching not the spectacle, but the outcome, who had said nothing and done everything. She thought about what it meant to be seen in a room full of people looking in the wrong direction. 3 weeks later, she was in the reading room of the Society Library, her usual table, her father's ledgers spread before her, a fresh translation half finished in her own handwriting, when she became aware of someone sitting down in the chair across from hers. She looked up. Edmund Ashford set a single document on the table between them. It was, she saw at a glance, a copy of the Land Council's preliminary findings, not public yet, not for weeks, folded to the page that bore her father's name. He did not explain how he had it. He did not say anything. She looked at the document. She looked at him. He was watching her with the same quality of attention he had given her in the ballroom, that particular stillness, the absence of performance, the impression of a man who had no interest in being anything other than what he was. "I have more translations to finish," she said. "I know," he said. "I thought you might want to know what you're working toward." She looked at the document again, at her father's name in official print, at the words "subject to review" written in a hand that meant the matter was not closed, but was, at least, open, at the fact that someone had placed it in front of her in a library on a cold November afternoon without expecting anything in return. She turned back to her translation. He did not leave. After a moment, she moved the ledger 3 inches to the left, making room on the table. Neither of them said anything about what this meant. The case of the Voss estate was concluded the following March. The decision was not announced at any ball. Nobody important was watching. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which was, it turned out, also a fine day for good news.